Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 1st, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we get into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because we rely on the support of listeners just like you. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. If you'd like to hear your name at the top of the show or gain access to ad-free episodes, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. All right, let's get into this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to chat with author and journalist Jennifer Wright. She recently wrote and published her sixth book. She really focuses on history. And her sixth book is called Madame Restel, The Life, Death, and Resurrection of Old New York's Most Fabulous, Fearless, and Infamous Abortionist. So what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, this kind of anti-hero and how it relates to some of the issues that we are facing right now with so many legal restrictions being enacted on a woman's right to choose. So without any further ado, here she is, Jennifer Wright. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So you are a nonfiction, specifically history writer. And of course, you're a history writer who is here on a sort of science-forward, social justice-oriented show. And you're here to talk about quite a famous, or maybe we should say infamous, abortionist. So it's a little bit of an interesting mix. What kinds of shows do you usually go on when you're promoting your work?
I tend to go on a lot of history shows. I've done Mysteries in the Museum, MSNBC, NPR, kind of anybody who's going to be interested in books about history or history that I try to tie to modern feminist issues.
Right. And I think that's what really interested me when your book came across my desk, is that my show, oh gosh, I just realized it's been on the air for 9 years now. And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, you're going to be, actually, I probably have it. This episode will be episode number, I'm just queuing it up so I can find out exactly. Episode number 452.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I guess that means we're entering into our 10th year because we do 50 episodes a year. So this, early on in the show, we were doing a lot of coverage of just general science, hard science, and, science books would come across my desk, different scientists or science communicators who would have interesting things to talk about. And I would just kind of say, yes, you're interesting. And then, after the first year or two, I was like, wow, I've interviewed a lot of white men. And so I decided to start making a conscious effort to ensure that there was a lot of representation and diversity on my show. And so it's very rare anymore that I even have men, especially, very rare that I have white men on the show. But I've been focusing a lot on feminist issues lately.
And
Cara,
so I think white men have stories too.
Oh, they do. And we hear them all day, every day, don't we? And so, I think this conversation about feminist issues and the intersection between feminism and feminist issues and science, biomedical science, health science, but really all sciences is not just interesting, but it's important for us to be having these conversations. And so, again, I don't often have historians or history writers on the show, but I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, I am so happy to be here.
So tell me first and foremost, who is the sort of main character of this story?
Well, Madame Restel was not born Madame Restel. She was born Anne Trow in Painswick, England in 1812. And she was born to a poor family. She entered service as a maid-of-all-work. When she was a teenager, she worked for a butcher, doing any kind of labor that the butcher needed done around the house. By about 16, she got married to a local tailor. And unfortunately, the tailor was an alcoholic. So Madame Ristel pretty quickly took over his profession for him. They had a daughter, and Madame Ristel decided, as so many immigrants have before her, that if they went to America, they could become rich. Now, unfortunately, this was much harder than Madame Ristel as a teenager might have imagined it. By 1831, she was living in New York on the Lower East Side, and her husband died, leaving her a single mother with a toddler. And being a single mother in that age meant that she really couldn't return to work as a maid. She was trying to make a living as a seamstress, but that certainly wasn't really enough to live on. If she went to work in a factory, she'd be working 16-hour days, and she would not be earning enough to have somebody else take care of her child. So what many women did, if they were mothers who had to go and work in factories, was drug their children with laudanum. It became known as the poor child's nurse, so their children would sleep most of the day when their mother was at
What?
work.
Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was a big problem. There are a lot of newspaper articles discouraging mothers from drugging their children because poor women would absolutely do this. There were also...
And just to, sorry to interject, but just to reiterate, what year would this have been?
This would have been in the 1830s.
1830s. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good to know. Learning
Right.
something. I'm going to learn a lot of new things.
You're going to learn a lot of terrible Dickensian facts. Other women would give their children to baby farmers, which would kind of function as daycares where you could pay to have a woman watch your child as long as you needed. However, those babies weren't given any breast milk at the time. They'd be given something called pap, which would be kind of ground up cow's milk and bread in an unsanitized vessel. So a lot of those kids would die. There was an incredibly high death rate among baby farmers, sometimes as high as 90%. So a lot of mothers chose not to do that. One of the saddest stories I heard from this period was about a woman who had a newborn and she had a 4-year-old. She had to go work in a factory. So she left her newborn with her 4-year-old. She came back and the 4-year-old very proudly reported that the baby had been crying, but he had stopped him. And when she went to check on the baby, she saw that the way that the 4-year-old had stopped him was by beating him in the head with a hammer. So these are really terrible stories about what it means to be a single mother in the Lower East Side at the time Madame Ristel was living there. And as Madame Ristel was kind of wrestling with these issues and must have been very frightened about what her own future held, she happened to live down the street from a pill compounder. And at that time, there was no oversight about what people put into pills. You could mash any herbs you had together into a pill and say that it would cure insomnia or stomach complaints or headaches or anything that you kind of imagined it might be able to cure. And what Madame Ristel started doing, seemingly more effectively than many other people, was creating pills that could produce an abortion. And she would use ingredients like tansy oil and turpentine that are somewhat effective but extremely dangerous. And these have still been used in recent history. In the 1970s, doctors said that turpentine emerges as a kind of harrowing motif in do-it-yourself abortions. There was an article in this century in the New York Times Magazine about a woman trying to induce her own abortion, drinking tansy tea while composing letters to her loved ones in case the tansy oil killed her. So these are things that will work, but there is also a very high risk of death. And the most remarkable thing about Madame Ristel's work in this area is that her potions did not seem to kill anyone. She very quickly started having patients who said that they had taken these 5 times and had 5 abortions. They were incredibly effective. Madame Ristel also learned how to do surgical abortions using a piece of whalebone that was sharpened at the end. So she was essentially performing a coat hanger abortion. Now, again, if Madame Ristel's hand slipped, she could easily puncture a woman's bladder. She could nick something in a way that would cause the woman to develop sepsis and die. Again, the most extraordinary thing to me about Madame Ristel wasn't the fact that she was an abortionist in this period, because she was not the only one doing this. There were many abortionists during this period. It's that there doesn't seem to be any record of her ever killing anyone. So she must have had a very steady hand and a great sense of how much turpentine and tansy oil you could mix together to get the desired results.
Was
And
it common at this time for women to be performing abortions?
almost always, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there
All
were
right.
men who did it, but midwifery was really a female dominated profession. Men at the time could not look at pregnant women when they were being trained as doctors, and they were discouraged from ever looking at a pregnant woman in the nude. So they were encouraged to avert their eyes when they were even examining a pregnant woman. They could kind of reach out and feel what was going on, but they didn't want to interfere with her modesty. So just by virtue of the fact that women had female bodies and some familiarity with the female anatomy, they had a huge advantage in terms of performing duties related to birth or abortions. So Madame Estelle learned how to do all of this, and her trade pretty immediately surpassed Dr. Evans, the man that she learned it from. And around this time, she met Charles Lohman, who would be her second husband. Charles Lohman was a printer, and he was very familiar with the bombastic personalities that were advertising at that time. And together, they created the persona of Madame Restell, who was supposedly a French woman who had trained in Paris. This was a time when Paris was really on the cutting edge of medical technology. It was known in some circles as the Paris period, and that Madame Rastell's grandwife had also been a very famous midwife. And this was to kind of reassure not only fairly desperate women on the Lower East Side, but also wealthy women, that this was someone that you could go to, someone who was going to have the sexual sophistication of a French person, and who could help you have an abortion.
So, what is it that's special about her? Is it the persona? Is it the sort of mystique and the marketing component that really draw you?
The marketing component was definitely a very big factor. And another thing that really made her unique was how outspoken she was about her profession. Most of the advertisements, even before the Comstock laws, you kind of read between the lines. People talk about how, they are a friend to soon to be mothers. They can do adoption. If your period has stopped, they can also help you start your period again. So there are a lot of ads that talk about a woman's flow being interrupted and how that might be very bad for a woman, and they have pills that can help. And if you were living during this period, you knew that that meant that this person can enact an abortion. But Madame Restell would write these huge opinion pieces about how birth control was an absolute social good. She likens it to a lightning rod averting the worst of nature's wrath. She talks about how it is actually a very bad thing to have more children than you can afford to care for, that that is a recipe for misery for families, that we've all seen women sicken and die because they've had too many children. So Madame Restell is really clear, not just about what she's doing, but about the fact that she believes that what she's doing is morally right.
I mean, I guess the outspoken component is possibly what's different, or it could be that other women saw this as a sort of quote necessary evil. I guess I'm curious if you, in your historical kind of investigations, came across what the general feeling, the tone was of abortionists in this time. Was it kind of like we're doing this even though we don't want to be because we'd rather women not do it on their own, or was it, this is a human right. This is a feminist ideal. We think that women should be free to make decisions about their family planning. What do you think was the general idea then?
I certainly don't think that Madame Restell thought that it was the right of every woman to make choices about her own body. I think she saw abortion as, and we know that because in one case, a woman wanted to have her child, and her father was paying Madame Restell to take the child from her and put it up for adoption, and Madame Restell did that against that woman's wishes. So Madame Restell was in this for money. But Madame Restell also believed that family limitation was very pragmatic. And I think that's probably why Madame Restell herself only had one child. And this was a time when many women were discovering that the average birth rate for women in America went from around 10 at the beginning of the 1800s to about 3 by 1900. And the way that birth rate was dropping in a time before reliable birth control was because people were having abortions. And that became necessary as America urbanized. If you have 10 children on a farm, um, if you can put them to work pretty early. By about 3, you can start giving them basic tasks around the farm. And when they grow up, they are going to be more hands on the farm to labor there with you. So having children, if you are living in rural society, is an advantage. Having children, if you are living in a one-room apartment in Manhattan, is a disadvantage. So a lot of people chose to have fewer children as they moved from a lifestyle that was built around farming to a lifestyle that took place in a city.
What were the contraception options that were available? Like, how did women choose to have fewer children?
Not much. Most of them chose to have fewer children by performing abortions. Abstinence was obviously an option. Condoms would become an option, but they would not be commonly used. Um, and they retained a stigma well into the 1900s. So if you have been a young woman in the country, you have probably encountered men who do not like wearing condoms when they have sex. So condoms were available, but not really, and they were very expensive. And other people would try other things. People would try to douche. People thought that if you jumped up and down after having sex, you could kind of shake out the sperm, and that might work. But you will notice that these are not things we would do today because they are not very effective things.
Right. So there was kind of a lot of, I mean, this is the era of sort of like patent medicine. It's the era of snake oil. It's the era of folk remedies. So a lot of people were trying to do a lot of different things. It's just they probably weren't very effective. They might have even been dangerous.
Were not very effective. Yes.
Right. Right. And so, okay. I mean, I think it's important to point out that clearly we're talking about the 1830s here. I think a lot of people, when they think about abortion, they think of this as sort of like a modern conversation, a modern political struggle. You know, we think about Roe v. Wade.
I think it's very important to note that abortion goes back as early as human recorded history. You will find records about abortion in ancient Egypt. There is a point often employed by anti-abortion groups saying that the Hippocratic Oath forbids abortion. What the Hippocratic Oath actually forbids is using an abortive pessary, which would have been a kind of pellet made of things like ground up beetles and other things that a woman could insert into her vagina to produce an infection that would then cause her to miscarry. Unfortunately, it often produced such a bad infection that the woman would also die. So if you read Hippocrates, which is obviously a combination of different authors, so they may have all had different opinions, but their advice is strenuous exercise to induce a miscarriage, or again, jumping up and down with your arms above your head. So these are things that human society has always been grappling with. This wasn't new in 1830. It certainly wasn't invented in the 1900s.
And obviously, you see a pretty firm, division in modern, let's say, American society, because that's sort of what we're specifically talking about here. You see a pretty firm division. You see that probably the vast majority of people promote and support a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to make decisions about her own health care and her own body. And you see a loud and vocal minority of individuals who are working very hard to ensure that there's legislation that prevents those rights from being fulfilled. Was it always, quote unquote, taboo? Was it always politicized? In the 1830s, was this done in a hush hush way, or was it like, yeah, people have abortions, deal with it?
Mark Twain said that it had become common for people to ask for an abortion from a doctor as easily as they would ask for a tooth to be pulled. And that was very upsetting to a great many people. And at the beginning of Madame Ristel's career, abortion was criticized. And the criticism was that this was going to enable adultery. That if you were a man and you had to go away on a business trip for 6 months, you could have relative certainty that your wife would be faithful to you because she might be pregnant when you came back, and then it would be a huge scandal. But as Madame Ristel's earliest critics point out, now your wife could be unfaithful to you every hour of the day when you're away, and there would be no visible consequences. So that was initially the thing that really frightened men, that this was going to upend the social order. And Madame Ristel wrote, I think, what is a very sensible retort to that in modern times, saying, like, do you think the only reason your wife wouldn't be a prostitute is because she lacks the opportunity to do it? Maybe you should find a woman who loves you. You should work on your marriage so she doesn't want to cheat on you constantly. And unfortunately, at the time, I think men were genuinely afraid that their marriages were not great, and their wife would take every opportunity to cheat on them if it was available. And that was a fear that was also rising as people moved to cities. If you lived on a farm, you, even if you were wealthy, you lived in pretty serious isolation. George Washington used to station one slave at the crossroads outside of his farm just to invite anyone who was passing by to come in and give them news of the world, because they were very isolated. So that was a thing that was changing as women moved to cities. Suddenly, you would be riding a streetcar with a lot of men. You would go out to parties where you would see a lot of men. You would be walking down the street, and you'd be walking perhaps alongside a handsome man who could just start talking to you.
I think it's important to point out, just to interject a little bit, that it has gone without saying, because you and I both don't need to say this when we're talking to one another, but for the listeners, the majority of whom of my show are men, clearly there is a wild double standard here. And that was probably, I mean, you tell me what you think based on some of your kind of historical research, but that was probably really steeped into this sort of paternalistic, patriarchal view and societal view of marriage, and maybe even in some cases coercive view of marriage.
Well, certainly this was a time when women were considered to be their husband's property.
Right. Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a time when women are just fighting to have the right to own property themselves and not have it go immediately to their husbands. So, yes, if you think of another person as essentially being your property, and it is her job to produce children for you, then the idea of abortion is immediately, before we get into any other issues, very threatening. And the time that this sort of evolved to be more about fetal personhood came a little bit later, in the 1850s. And Horatio Storer, a doctor, led the Physicians' Crusade against abortion. And he starts referring to the embryo always as a potential male or the future young man, and talking about how the woman is just supposed to be a kindly nest for the future young man. Now, if you've been pregnant, you will probably find that your health is much more intertwined with the fetus than that. It is not the way it's so often portrayed on anti-abortion posters, where a fetus is just kind of floating by itself in a pink cloud. That pink cloud is your body. So everything that is happening with the fetus is also happening to you. Horatio Storer was really the first one to say, after she's pregnant, a woman is just a nest. We only have to focus on the potential male. And he also talks about how, women are prone to depression and hysteria and they don't really know what they want. And that's why it is male doctors and not the woman who have to safeguard the fetus, which is a very insulting worldview. But one of Horatio Storer's other real concerns was that this was a time of massive immigration, mostly by the Irish, to America. And Horatio Storer was very concerned about the fact that upper class white Protestant women were often the ones who could afford abortion. Madame Restell could charge up to $100 for an abortion. And even if Madame Restell also worked on a sliding scale, she lowered prices dramatically for anyone who was working in service. But if this was kind of seen as being a service that was frequently used by upper middle class white women, those are the women that Horatio Storer wanted to procreate. And he talks about how, I'm not going to quote it perfectly, I wish I could remember it perfectly, about how upon women's loins rests the future of the country. Will it be populated with our children or those of aliens? So there is
right. So clearly there's some very eugenicist like tendencies going on here.
I wouldn't say it's eugenics yet. I think eugenics.
Is that only because we hadn't labeled it as such?
Eugenics have the idea of the best from the best. It's a little separate. It's just xenophobia. Like, it's just fear of a great replacement at this point. That there are going to be too many Irish people in the country instead of the special white Protestant babies that we like. Now, lest people think that Horatio Storer really just wanted a world full of beautiful bouncing babies, Horatio Storer also removed women's ovaries if he thought that they were hysterical in any way.
Right. I'm sorry, but that's eugenics. It is,
okay,
right?
Yeah.
He's saying that the Irish are less than and that women with mental health issues are less than. They're not going to produce the best children.
They're not going to produce
we should
the best
prevent
children.
them from producing. Yeah.
You know what? Yeah, you've convinced me. Yeah, it's eugenics. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, this is terrible. I don't like this guy at all. So
he's
when
not
was
a good guy.
No, and he was at the exact same time, or he predated?
Was a little bit later. He was
later.
Okay. The Physicians' Crusade, starting in 1857. So he would be a real opponent of Madame Restell's. And in 1859, the American Medical Association accepted all his findings. They decided that they were going to be against abortion. And that took about a century to be overturned. So Horatio Storer did a lot of damage if you are somebody who believes in a woman's right to have an abortion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we're seeing that sort of against the background and kind of continuing forward in time. Obviously there have probably been ebbs and flows throughout human history about, moralistic ebbs and flows, arguments about these things. But specifically in Madame Restell's time, you see that there's this kind of puritanical push.
Well, a lot is changing in Madame Restell's time. You do have this massive influx of immigrants to the country that made a lot of people very frightened. And you also had women who were suddenly starting to demand the right to vote. And a lot of people were very upset by this. There's one incredibly long article that I mention in the book, and we're talking like thousands and thousands of words. And the crux of this article is, what if women start deciding they want to become teachers instead of being mothers? That would be so bad, right? Can you imagine how bad that would be? And I think even the most conservative person today is not especially frightened by the notion of a woman becoming a teacher. But these were issues that were incredibly threatening to men at the time. And again, like, there was also this fear of, what if I'm a man and I can no longer sort of use my wife as property that will produce my children? What if she decides she wants to be a suffragette or a teacher, or she wants to go off and do other things? That's very threatening.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, was she active? Was Madame Restell active in directly responding to these kinds of arguments?
Madame Restell had nothing to do with the suffragette movement. She was not interested in it. The suffragettes were primarily Quakers. They lived a very simple, very humble life. They are on the right side of every historical issue. We should just see whatever the Quakers are doing right now and follow their lead. But Madame Restell was someone who built a mansion. She was covered in diamonds. She was riding through the street in an incredibly glamorous carriage. She was fighting with everybody in the newspapers. There is a letter I read from an early suffragette that talked about how all of these women were so scared of public speaking that after they finished public speaking, they all did like a really big group hug, and they cried a little bit, and they talked about how it was scary, but they did it. And I think about Madame Restell just like flicking off police officers when she's arrested, or telling them that she's not going to jail until she finishes a full oyster lunch in front of them. I cannot see Madame Restell temperamentally getting along with the suffragettes. But another important point of suffragettes during this period is that they needed to make it clear that they were against abortion, because a lot of the anti-suffragette rhetoric had to do with these evil women hate children, and they don't want to be mothers. And if you let women have the right to vote, they'll abandon their children. Men will be left doing all the housework. And suffragettes, I think, very intelligently leaned into the fact that they were doing this because they loved their children, that they were doing this because you already trusted them to raise their children. So shouldn't they have a voice in how, say, schools in the country were run? And they could only do that by voting. Shouldn't they be able to make decisions that would specifically benefit their children? And I think for that reason, they really needed to say that we do not support abortion. We have nothing to do with that.
It's interesting that there's so sadly this false dichotomy that either I love children or I'm
I love
anti-abortion
children, or
I'm
I'm
pro-abortion. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And that was something that I think, individual suffragettes may have felt differently, or they might have felt very strongly anti-abortion. But I think from, again, a pragmatic level, it was an issue that they could not support at that time.
I guess I'm just curious about this experience of recognizing the gray area and recognizing the complexity of historical figures and writing about them in a way that really sheds light on the fact that the stories that we tell, the narratives that we often are drawn to, are the simplistic narratives of good over evil, or of the hero versus the bad the bad guy. But Madame Restell's an interesting character because she's doing, in many ways, a very good thing for kind of the wrong reasons.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I shouldn't read Goodreads, but I do. And my favorite review of this is, if you guys are looking for an unvarnished hero who did everything she could to support women's right to choose, know that Madame Restell is an unrepentant capitalist, LOL. Yeah, she's probably not doing this. She's doing this because she sees a social necessity for it, in the way that I think you could be somebody who sees a social necessity for any number of things. She came to America to make a lot of money. She needs to take care of her daughter, and she figured out a way to make a lot of money doing something that many people felt a need for.
Yeah. And so what drew you to her then? I mean, personally now, not just,
Oh,
okay, she's an interesting character, but like, what made you want to keep going with her?
Well, look, I'm a little bit in love with Madame Restell. One of the first things I read about her that just delighted me was that when she was taken to prison, she was visited by a Christian moral reform society, and they tried to give her some biblical tracts. And she told them, "No, thank you. I have enough novels." Madame Still is really funny. She's really funny. She's really outspoken. I agree with her on a lot of her points. I agree with her that birth control is a social good, that it is not good for women to have more children than they feel equipped to take care of. And I think she is making those points earlier than anyone else. She also has a level of confidence that I don't have. If people wrote about me as critically as they wrote about Madame Restell in the press, my first reaction would not be, I'm going to fight this in the press until I have the last word. My reaction would just be to like go off and cry quietly in my bedroom. So I love that she has this massive level of confidence in the 1850s. She's also a figure who I think got to enjoy the fruits of her labor, and that was almost as upsetting to people at the time as the fact that she was performing abortions. There was this kind of strain of writing in the press that talks about how, oh, isn't it terrible that she's doing all these abortions? She's truly taking the femininity away from women, and also shouldn't she be doing them for free if she's doing them? And no, she was not doing them for free. She was making a ton of money. She built a massive mansion on a plot of land that the Archbishop of New York wanted to build on. She outbid him probably because he spoke about her critically in a sermon, and then built a mansion on that plot of land where she continued performing abortions. She is this really larger than life figure, and she's the kind of figure that we usually only see in men. I feel like there's a really boring narrative when it comes to women in history. That when it comes to men in history, you get to read about people like Al Capone. You get to read about or Vlad the Impaler, or Henry VIII, these kind of scary, larger than life figures that are not just incredibly good people. And when it comes time for Women's History Month as a child in school, I guess you get to do Amelia Earhart, and she flew a plane, and that's nice. Or Mother Teresa or Florence Nightingale. They're all, those women, as you read more about them, you find out that those women had interesting personal lives and their own flaws. But the women that history usually presents to us are women whose work can at least be seen as pretty flawless.
Right. I mean, you're right. They're sanitized for the narrative, for
they
sure.
Are very sanitized. But nobody's trying to sanitize Henry VIII. The only thing we know about him is he killed all his wives. Again, obviously, we know a lot more about Henry VIII. He's very interesting. He figures into one of my books before this, but we are usually presented with very sanitized versions of women, and those women aren't that interesting to me. Maybe I do not want to join the suffragettes' weepy group hug after they bravely did some public speaking.
I see her as an anti-hero, or do you see her as a hero, or is she somewhere in between?
I see her as a human being. I see her the way I see most people, that she had huge flaws of personality, and she also did things that are wonderful. There are moments where I would read along and I would be so proud of her for the decision she was making and how brave she was being. And there were also moments where she's just a nightmare. She's just such a petty bitch. But that is what it is to know a person. I don't think we love people in our lives because they are flawless all the time. And I think it's a little bit of a problem for modern society that we still expect women to be flawless. We allow men to have many flaws and can still see them as interesting people.
Do you worry about kind of paralleling people like Al Capone and Henry VIII, who legit did really bad things, with somebody who may have been flawed and may have been petty, but did very good
Oh yeah,
things?
no, I think Madame Restell is much better than Al Capone.
Okay.
I think she did very good things. I also think she essentially kidnapped someone's child.
Mm-hmm. So
I,
she's got a bad track record as well.
she's got
Right.
like she's made some questionable decisions,
Right.
but no, I think the work that she was doing was incredibly important. I am extremely pro-choice. I don't believe that you can say that women are truly free unless they have ownership over their own bodies. I don't think you should, even if you fully believe that a fetus is a person, I do not think any man will ever be obligated to act as a life support system for another person. So I am on Madame Restell's side that somebody has to perform abortions. Thank God she performed them well. And I do not begrudge her the fact that she was making money off of it.
Right. So, as we think about this story and we think about, all of the things that are in this book that we don't clearly have time to get to, I'm curious for the listeners right now who might be interested in buying the book and reading about her story. What are some of the things that you hoped as you were writing, because clearly as a writer of historical nonfiction, your voice, you're not just a Xerox machine for history. Like, you have your own voice that is going into how you tell this story. And so I'm curious, what are you hoping that people will gain, that they will see, that they will be able to tap into from reading your
Well,
words?
something that I think is really important about this book is that when Madame Restell began her work in New York, abortion prior to the quickening, which is when a woman feels the fetus move inside her, it usually happens around 5 months, was just considered a misdemeanor. It was punishable by a fine. And by the end of Madame Restell's life, the Comstock laws had been passed, and you could not send anything obscene through the mail, which included, say, any description of how you might have an abortion or how you might get birth control. So Wright's really rolled back very, very far in a 40-year period in Madame Restell's life. And I think it's important to remember that you do not necessarily get to keep the rights that you were born with. You have to keep fighting for them continually. And that feels very important in relation to the abortion discussion today. I also think that one thing we can kind of learn from Madame Restell is Madame Restell doesn't have any female friends. Madame Restell, I think, was flawed in thinking that, like, I don't need the vote. I bribe all the politicians. She sends them all gold watches. They leave her alone. It's fine. And most of the people Madame Restell worked with were men because those were people who had power at that time. But if Madame Restell had instead worked with other groups of women who were performing abortions at this time, if they had gotten together and said, okay, let's start writing articles about how our services are necessary. Let's start talking to suffragettes about how this is a social good. That might have, I don't know if anything could have stopped the social push that criminalized abortion during this period, but I think it could have slowed it a little bit. I think it is a reminder that a group of people are always more powerful than one person standing alone, even if that person is very rich and very successful. So I think that might be another thing that people could take away from this. And maybe the most important thing is just remembering that abortion is not a modern issue. Abortion is something that has been very common through all of history. It's estimated now that during the mid 1800s, about 1 in 5 pregnancies was terminated by abortion. Horatio Storer thought it was a little higher in New York. He thought it was closer to 1 in 4. And in 1898, 25 years after the passage of the Comstock laws, that again forbade even sharing information about abortion, the Michigan Board of Health estimated that about 1 in 3 pregnancies in their state were terminated in abortion. So you cannot stop abortion. It is a fact of life in any historical period. And all you can really do by banning it is make it less safe.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Of course. Then women are just going to, like you were mentioning, the turpentine abortion. Obviously, they were doing what they could back then with the knowledge that they had. We have more knowledge than that now. So why not
We
utilize it?
have more
Oh, because we're
knowledge
not allowed to.
because you're not allowed to. And people, I think, after Roe versus Wade was repealed, I heard a lot of optimism from people who share my opinions on the left, talking about how, like, it's going to be okay. We have abortion pills now. People will just get abortion pills. And quite obviously, the first thing that the right will do is ban your access to abortion pills. Uh, Before long, we will hear about women taking very risky steps to terminate their pregnancies. You are going to hear about women throwing themselves down the stairs again, and it's going to happen soon.
Right. I agree. I agree. And it's devastating. It's heartbreaking. And I think if anything, hopefully this conversation and hopefully your book helps to draw people's attention to
Yeah,
just that.
and if most of your listeners are male, like, first of all, thank you for listening so long. But also, if men can speak out about it, about how abortion is also an issue they care about, just on kind of human rights grounds, that somebody shouldn't be forced to serve as an incubator for another person, I think that's really helpful. Men listen to other men.
Yeah. Oh, of course, of course. And apparently to this podcast. So thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. And gosh, thank you. Everybody, the book is Madame Restell, The Life, Death, and Resurrection of Old New York's Most Fabulous, Fearless, and Infamous Abortionist by Jennifer Wright. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.